So in this video we are going to build this alert. When we click no, it disappears with the transition, and when we click yes, it disappears with the transition as well as logs the user out, right? First we'll open the file which has this logout button. We'll have an on click function. So on click, so we'll have an arrow function. Inside this arrow function we need to set the state for the alert. Whenever the state is true, the alert will show. We need to make this a block, and now we'll explicitly return our JSX. So return our JSX. We'll have a state for our alert. So const show alert set show alert. So this will be useState. So initially it will be false, right? So we'll take this state setting function and place it inside our logout on click button. So we'll pass true as an argument, right? So whenever the user clicks on this button, so the alert state will be set true and the alert will be shown. So we'll use this state here, right? So if show alert is true, then alert. So right now if we click on this button, alert is shown, right? So we need to replace this with our custom component, right? So for that we'll create a new folder called alert. Inside this we'll create a new file called alert.module.css and alert.js. So first we'll import the styles from dot slash. So alert will be a functional component. So const alert equals to, so this will return a div which says alert component. We'll export this, export default alert, right? Let's save. Instead of having a div, we'll have our custom component, right? So alert, so this is our custom component, alert component here. So this component will receive three props, right? The first one is message. So the message would be, are you sure you wanna log out? And the second one would be yes. So whenever the user clicks yes, so this function will run. So we'll have a yes function for that. Const yes would be a arrow function. So we'll pass our yes function inside this prop, yes. And the third argument would be like we'll just pass this state setting function. So this would be equals to this. Let's save it. Since our alert is a reusable component, we have three props. So whenever we reuse this alert component, we could send different props so that our alert acts differently. So for example, instead of logging out, we have a record which we want to delete. So whenever the user clicks on the delete button for that record, we can send a different message. Are you sure you want to delete this record? Like that. For logging out, we'll have a logout API call, right? But for delete, we'll delete the record from database. Right now we only have a way to show our alert, right? When we click the button, this is set to true, then our alert is visible. But to dismiss the alert, we can only do it inside the alert, right? So whenever the user clicks on the yes button, no button, backdrop for the alert, we want to dismiss the alert, right? So for that we are passing the state setting function of the alert, right? And here inside our yes function we'll also set the state, right? So this would be set to false as well. Okay, so we'll go inside our alert. Inside the main div we'll have two more divs, div 1 and div 2. One div is for the message. So first we'll receive the props. One is message, second one is yes, third one is set show alert, right? So we'll place the message here and we'll have two buttons inside the second div, right? So button 1 would be yes, button 2 would be no. And for the yes button on click, we'll pass the yes function, right? So on click would be yes and no buttons on click. So on click would be no. So we'll have an arrow function, const no equals to an arrow function. It's saved. So our message is visible. So when we click on yes, this function will run. This would ultimately set this state to false, and if this is false, our alert would disappear, right? So that's why when we click yes, our alert disappears, but when we click no, nothing happens because there's nothing inside here. So we can also set the alert inside our no function, set to false, and now when we click no, our alert disappears. When we click yes, our alert disappears. But we need to style our alert, right? So I have some CSS styles. I'll just copy paste it. Very little styles. We have two classes, so main div and buttons div, right? So this would be our main div. So class name styles dot main div, and the second one is class name styles dot buttons div. We'll hit save. Bam. We also need to have a backdrop for our alert, right? So for that we'll create a new folder inside our UI folder. So backdrop, create a new file called backdrop.module.css, another file called backdrop.js. So first we'll import the styles, import styles from dot slash styles. This would be a functional component. Backdrop would be, should have props. So this would return a div. Let's say we'll export this. Export default backdrop. So on this div we'll have two props. The first prop is on click. This would be props dot on click, and the second one is class name. So this would have two class names. So we are using template literals. First one would be from styles dot backdrop. The second class name would be from props dot class name, right? Whenever we use our backdrop, we can pass on click function as well as class names to our custom backdrop, right? We need to style our backdrop class inside our styles, right? Copy paste, hit save. So right now our backdrop is not visible because we are not even using it. So here inside our alert we'll use our backdrop. So we'll, beside our main div, we'll place our backdrop, right? So just above our main div we'll have our backdrop. So backdrop, we'll import the backdrop, hit save, right? But when we click on the backdrop, the pop-up doesn't disappear. So we'll pass the no function inside the on click of our backdrop. So on click would be equals to no. Now if we hit save and when we click on the backdrop, our backdrop disappears, right? When we click on no, it disappears. When we click on yes, it disappears. When we click on the backdrop, it disappears. But when we click inside the model itself, it doesn't disappear. And that's exactly what we want. We have a problem now. The logic works, but we don't see any transition, right? We want the model to disappear smoothly and not instantly, right? So for that, we'll use useEffect. So first, we'll go inside our app.css. We'll have two class names, right? So for the transition to work, we have to do this. So opacity would be 0. So transition would be 0.3 seconds and opacity would be 0. We'll copy this, paste it here and paste it here. So opacity 1 would be opacity 1. We'll just save this, right? We'll close our app.css. And now inside our alert component, we'll have a state for our opacity. So const opacity set opacity. So initially our opacity would be 0, right? So opacity 0. Initially this would be 0. This opacity state is a class name, right? So we'll use the class name inside our backdrop as well as our main div, right? So class name would be equals to opacity. So we'll make this a template literal because we have two class names. First one is main.div, second one is opacity itself. Right, let's save. And right now if we click our logout, nothing is visible because we are just setting the opacity to 0. The backdrop opacity is also 0, the main div opacity is also 0. So for example, if I change this and hit save, it's visible, right? But when the opacity is set to 0, when I click on the logout button, it's not showing up. So now we'll have the useEffect. We'll pass a callback function with an empty dependency array. So this will run whenever the alert loads, right? So inside this we'll set the opacity to 1, opacity as 1, right? So whenever the logout button is clicked, we see the transition. So each time whenever the logout button is clicked, right, the opacity is set from 0 to 1, right? That's why the transition shows up. But when we dismiss the alert, the transition is not visible. So we need to use setTimeout for that, right? So inside our no function, what we'll do is we'll set the opacity back to opacity to 0. We'll set the opacity to 0, and inside our setTimeout, right, so this callback function will run after 300 milliseconds, right? Inside this callback function we'll set the alert as false. We'll hit save. So when we click no, it has transition, but when we click on yes, it doesn't have any transition. So right now yes is a function directly used inside our onClick. So let's say this is a header is a parent and alert is the child, and yes is a method from parent, right? So this yes method is inherited by child, which is alert. So this yes method is inherited, right? So inheritance is a concept where the child can modify the inherited method. So what we'll do is we'll modify this inherited method, right? So we'll have our own yes function. Const yes would be yes. So what we'll do is we'll just copy this and paste it here, and instead of setting this, we'll set props dot yes. So instead of calling the set show alert, we'll just call props dot yes, right? And we'll also replace this to props dot set show alert, and here we'll also replace to props dot message, and you guessed it right, we'll remove these three to replace it with props. Let's save. And now right now if you click on yes, the transition is visible. But we have another problem as well. The user is not logged out when we click yes. So for that we need to log out the user instead of setting the alert to false, right? So we'll comment this out. So logging out a user can be making an API call. Since we are not making an API call, so I have set a global state for logged in user using the Justin library. So first I'll import our global state. So import use var store from // from state / state. This is our global state. So inside our global state we have a function, right? So we'll pull that function out. So const set is user valid. We'll pull this function out from use dash store. This will receive a callback function which has state as an argument, and this will return state dot set is user valid function. So whatever this callback function returns would ultimately be returned by this use dash store. so we are returning a function. So when we look inside our use bash store, set is user valid is a function, right? So we are pulling this function out here. We are pulling this function out here and storing it in a variable, and now we'll use this function and we'll call this function pass false as an argument. So whenever the user clicks yes button in our alert, so this function would be run, and this function would ultimately set the user's valid state to false, right? So yeah, we are pulling this function out. So this function would run whenever the user clicks yes, the yes button, and this function would set the is user valid to whatever the argument we passed, which is false. So when we pass false as an argument to this function, is user valid state would be set to false, right? So when we click yes, the model disappears with the transition as well as the user logs out. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. So I have used React Router DOM in some previous videos. So I have used sustain to set the user logged in state. You can check those previous videos out. Thanks for watching this video. I'm logging out right now.